Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. This is Daniel Estulin, and welcome to Estulin.media. Today, my guest is a very unusual person. He's also a writer for my American publisher, Trine Press, Chris Milligan. His name is Adam Finnegan. We're going to meet him in a second, and he's the author of, I just read the book yesterday, The Sleeper Agent, The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator, Antigens of Biological Warfare. Adam, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be on your show. I respect you and your work, and we have a lot to talk about.
Thanks so much. So, a friend of ours, our mutual friend, sent me a copy of your book. He told me about your book, and I became instantly interested because it just happened to be like one of my best friends, someone I've been friends with since 1989. He used to be a missionary in Africa back in the 1960s. He has Lyme disease. He's now 73 or 74 years old. His father was a principal lawyer to former Prime Minister of Canada, not Justin Trudeau, not this guy, his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So we're talking about people who have a lot of money, have a lot of power. He is very left-wing, which is one of the reasons he went to Africa, became a missionary. But in any case, he has Lyme disease, and he's not quite sure how he got it. So when I got this book and I started reading it, I realized to what extent we're looking at not an accident, but biological warfare. So before we actually get into the interview, why don't you tell us very briefly, what is the book about? Because it's not a big book. It's 336 pages long. And but in any case, I hope you do well, because it's a very, very important book, especially in light of all the stuff that's happening right now. So what's it about?
So essentially, it is about stealth biological warfare or stealth biological weapons, and those that were created around World War II and the Cold War. And it largely centers around a German virologist, Erich Traub, and his study of this chronic disease, which was caused by immunosuppression or immune exhaustion. And it was a phenomenon he found called and they called it eventually immune tolerance, but it just means chronic immunosuppression. And in the book, I am able to link Lyme disease and its co-infections to the work of Erich Traub. He was a bioweaponeer. He was a German virologist, but and a veterinarian, but he was a bioweaponeer, and he made a career out of turning animal diseases to human diseases.
Well, actually, we're going to talk about that as well, because that's frightening. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Lyme disease. Not a lot of people, I live in Mexico, not a lot of people know anything about this, but in Canada, okay, especially people who live around livestock, and in the United States, it's becoming quite an issue. So what is Lyme disease? How do people get it? Where does it come from? Or how was it engineered to be what it is today?
Okay, so Lyme disease is a spirochete called Borrelia burgdorferi. It was publicly discovered in 1983, but I'm sure they had discovered it long before. It was just in a classified setting. And it is spread by ticks. It is spread by ticks, and oftentimes you won't get just Lyme disease, but a whole cocktail of different co-infections, like babesiosis, which is a blood parasite like malaria. Then you've got Bartonella, which is a really nasty one. And then you've got things like human monocytic ehrlichiosis. It's a rickettsia. Rickettsia is a class of bacteria, just like typhus is a rickettsia. But there are different rickettsia co-infections, but then and so those other ones that I had listed, often you'll get all of those in one bite. And this was something that Erich Traub had learned in 1939, how these mix of infections could create this complex picture. And I can link it to him because I can show when he acquired the spirochete, and it was from a bird strain of Borrelia. It was like bird Lyme disease, you could say. It was a bird strain, and then he adapted it to all these different land animals and also to humans. And it had been weaponized in Germany first, and that's where it first shows up. And then during his second tenure in the United States,
Germany, do you mean Germany, First World War, Second World War, in between the wars, after the war?
in the Second World War. So he acquired the spirochete in 1939. And it was the same year he was taught about how these mix of infections could create this complex disease. And so he started weaponizing it during the war at a facility that was like Germany's Plum Island, which was called Insel Reims. It fell under Russian occupation at the close of the war. They took strains to the Soviet Union. Also, Donald Maclean, the British diplomat, also took strains to the United States probably just after 1945 from Eric Traub. And then Eric Traub came back over here in 1948 and weaponized it once again. And he was also, your listeners will be interested to hear, he was also back and forth between Colombia and the eastern United States.
Let me just interrupt you for a second. So, for our audience, Adam is suffering from Lyme disease. So, what are the symptoms? So that people actually understand when we're talking about bioterrorism, when we're talking about some of these horrible experiments have been conducted on people the world over. Okay, what do you live with on a daily basis?
So, I mean, when I got sick in 2016. It was like the worst headaches you could imagine. And they were a very strange feeling. They felt very strange. And it was almost like your whole head feels like it's almost like buzzing. It's a weird sensation, but it also feels like your brain's being crushed. It causes something called encephalitis, or a low grade one, not the kind that you'd see in a scan, but a low grade one that is just as tormenting. And I would say, so you got a whole range of symptoms. You got chronic fatigue, you got joint pain, arthritis, the whole fibromyalgia. And there are also other ones, varying degrees of different symptoms. I know it is what is called neurotropic. So it takes to the brain and central nervous system, and that will, and here's another thing. It also reactivates dormant viruses within you because it sheds these, it sheds a bewildering array of these immune damaging lipids in small particles called blebs. So it's almost like you can imagine like a wet dog shaking its coat, right? And all the water coming off. Well, it'd be like that, only the water are these immune damaging lipids that it's shedding into the bloodstream. And so when that happens, it brings on this condition that he discovered called immune tolerance, or chronic immunosuppression, immune deficiency, you could call it. And at that point, when the immune system is compromised, all of these dormant viruses, like, for example, Epstein-Barr virus, there are a bunch of other ones like cytomegalovirus, all of these start reactivating and cause a systemic chronic disease from head to toe.
So basically, you are in constant pain all day long.
Yeah, I mean, my headaches never go away. They're always there. I've gotten used to it over the years, but they're always there.
You know that in Canada, for example, doctors refuse to acknowledge that there's such a thing as Lyme disease. So, my friend, his name is Jeff, he's had it for about 10 or 12 years now. He lives on a farm, and same thing, he pulled the tick out of his back. He went to a series of doctors and hospitals and experts. And they had told him there's no such thing as Lyme disease. He had to actually go to the United States to get some medicine for it. Let me ask you something else, just not to change the subject, just so people understand that we're talking to somebody who actually understands really well, because he's suffering this on a daily basis. So there's something that caught my attention in your book. You said you mentioned it earlier, that the animal kingdom and animal disease are a vast reservoir of this new human pathogens in endless varieties. And before the advent of modern genetic engineering was done through the use of animal pathogens to bring about desired mutations. Can you translate this into a language that most people can understand? What does that mean?
Okay, so before the advent of what they call recombinant DNA technology, which is the CRISPR technology and all the technology for genetic engineering. Before that was available, they used, and they still use this today, actually, and I'll get into why that is. So the way they brought about desired mutations is they would run it through certain animals, and it would bring about a desired quality. When it would mutate, it would often mutate and take to certain organs. So mouse passages, for example, raised the neurotropic qualities. It raised the ability for these agents to take to the brain and central nervous system in a more profound way. Of course, when they adapted foot and mouth disease virus to the mice to make it neurotropic, they had to run it through 140 mice, I think it was, before that desired mutation would happen. But they got this down to a science, and there was actually a diagram I had posted in one of my videos about sometimes it became such a fine art. Like Eric Traub would often, when he was adapting things to different animals, so that's another reason they use it, is for adapting it to different animals. But he would often run it through one animal, like the mouse, and then he'd run it through a chicken egg, and then he'd run it through a mouse again, let the disease play out, re-isolate it, then back into a chicken egg. And so he'd alternate the passages. It was rather unusual, and people would be rather surprised to see how that was done. But I have all these diagrams, so. And I think it was the chicken eggs that he used often to adapt it to humans, because we have a similarity between the bird and we have a similarity between the avian immune system. The bird's immune systems have many things in common with ours. And of course, the mice would always raise the neurotropic qualities, and chicken passages and such would raise the myotropic qualities, the ability of it to take to the musculoskeletal system. And they had all sorts of different ways of modifying pathogens through different animals, running it through different animals. I don't know why it was that it would bring about these desired mutations, but it was, and that was like their entire way of doing it back then. And even to this day, bioweapons are still done in this way because the genetic engineering technology leaves evidence of tampering. Whereas when you use animal passages, it looks like natural evolution from an animal. So, today of gain of function research, right? You've heard that term, raising the virulence of a pathogen. Well, oftentimes in these gain of function programs, they will be in a lab with certain animals, like, for example, ferrets, and they would be passing it through ferrets to make it more contagious, able to spread from animal to animal or person to person.
So can animal diseases be modified to infect humans? And what are the best animals? What are the best experiments that they've done? And how was it done?
Yeah, so it seemed that he used chicken eggs to adapt it to humans. Like, for example, there was a virus called vesicular stomatitis virus that Traub adapted to chicken eggs, and then all these people in the USDA started getting sick with it. When he came over here, that was one of the pathogens that he had adapted to humans. So any disease can be adapted to humans. And Eric Traub also had a method of he had a method of adapting pathogens to any animal or humans. It was all very easy to do. And it seems that chicken eggs was one of the ways in which he would do that. Foot and mouth disease virus, for example, it seems that when he adapted it to chicken eggs, it became what is today known as Coxsackie virus. And that shows up in like 1948 and 49. And he had cultures with him. But yes, all of these, so that's what he made a fine art of doing, is adapting animal diseases to humans.
How about this biological warfare? Because I ask you this because for most people, when you mention biological warfare, we immediately think of World War I, but it actually goes way, way beyond that, or before that.
Yeah, I would say that biological warfare is something that is very ancient and has been utilized. I mean, as far back as our history goes. I mean, you had instances where someone could take a decomposing corpse and throw it into somebody's drinking well. These were all primitive forms, of course.
During the bubonic plague epidemic.
Yeah, that too. I haven't studied that in depth, but I would bet to say that was probably also engineered somehow. Back then they had ways of doing things like this. And also in the 1700s, and I think it was like, I forget what year it was. Maybe it was like 1776. I have the first U.S. President, George Washington, quoted on the British using smallpox as a weapon. So smallpox was one of those, and the British also would take infected blankets from smallpox cases and give it to the Native Americans and basically wipe them out. And
nobody talks about that. Let me ask you something else. We can't talk about bioweapons without touching on the Spanish flu of 1918. What was that? How was that put together, or engineered, I should say, maybe?
Yeah, that was so Russian intelligence had suspected that this was a British biological weapon because most of the deaths occurred on the Russian side. And there is actually some evidence that would support that in my book. They were doing all sorts of research on this viral and bacterial synergy, because in the 1918 cases, the bacteria would be the thing that finishes them off. So they'd get an initial viral infection, but then they would get bacterial pneumonia that would deliver the death blow. And they were doing all this research on that. And so, and the 1918 influenza also bleeds into this bioterrorism campaign from Germany in 1914 and 15 that was begun in 1914 and 15. And they were going around infecting the horses, all of the military and medical horses. But the thing is, it wasn't just horses that would be pulling carts. These were also horses that were being used for serums and vaccines. So when they would use something inapparent, like there is a biological warfare agent called melioidosis, which is a form of glanders. Glanders was a horse disease, a bacterial horse disease that was common back then. And they went around infecting these horses. It seems that they were infecting these horses with that agent, and it was something that would remain inapparent for a while, while they're being processed, because the tissues, the horse serum was also used to make vaccines. In the agar that they would grow the meningococci. So there was a meningococci vaccine program by the Rockefeller Institute in Kansas. And that these horses were also being infected by these saboteurs. So when they went down there to start that meningococcus vaccine program, that's where the Spanish flu ends up, showing up first. And it was just 1 month after they had finished that whole vaccine program. And now, if it didn't come from the vaccine itself, it would have been enhanced by it. It would have greatly enhanced it and allowed it to mutate into what it became.
So let me ask you something else. I want to ask you about the research utilized in weaponizing pathogens. How many of them are out there? Because, we like, if you ask anyone out, people are going to say, well, I don't know. But there are quite a few of them. You list a lot of them in your book.
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, and today, we've been basically, so it seems that there was this Day X that was carried out by the Soviet Union by a large-scale bioterrorism against the West. Traub was involved in it, and there were other people too. And so numerous pathogens were released. I go over some of those in a later chapter where I talk about Traub's, his weapons and such. So you had the vesicular stomatitis, you had the foot and mouth disease, you had the lymphocytic choriomeningitis epidemics, and they were going around destroying all the hamsters because they would be processed to use vaccines. So vaccine sabotage was a big thing too. And then, after that, they kept attacking us because every time they attack us, we don't say anything. We actually cover for our enemies, and that goes into that whole blackmail thing, the tripartite blackmail. But as far as, there are so many.
You're talking about blackmail, you're talking about the Americans, the British, and the Russians. We're going to get in a second. So I wanted to ask you, let's talk a little bit about the, Trine, I suppose he was the double agent for the Soviets, wasn't he?
Yes. When Traub's German facility, Inselreims, fell under Soviet occupation, and it seems that they had been able,
World War II.
Yep, he was probably blackmailed with war crimes because they were especially interrogating his female staff about war crimes. If they had been disposing of human bodies and such in the incinerator used to incinerate animals. And it seems they probably had war crimes on him because there was forced labor at Inselreims. And he was developing a human avian influenza vaccine, and it was probably being tested just like in the concentration camps. So he came over here, and he was a double agent of the KGB, and so he unleashed all of these biological weapons on us, and then he was turning down the top positions to head Plum Island, and they kept wondering why he kept turning it down. And then, right at that point, Donald McLean had defected to the Soviet Union, and Donald McLean was the one who was instrumental in getting Traub over here. So it initiated an interrogation, and John Loftus's friend Dan Benjamin interrogated him, and Traub confessed to being a Soviet double agent when he was tripped up in a lie. And Dan Benjamin said something like, "Do you have anything to say before you're hauled off as a Soviet double agent of the KGB?" And it was a bluff, but Traub at that point believed it, and he confessed to being an agent of the KGB.
Well, let me stop in for a second, and let's just double back to so we're at the end of World War II. Okay, we're coming into the Operation Paperclip. You have the Russians, the Americans, the British, and everybody's vying for the British scientists, for the Nazi scientists at the end of World War II. Some of them were, whisked away to the United States. Some of them went to London. A lot of them went to Russia. So first of all, can you explain to us what was Operation Paperclip and how were some of these people were divided? Because again, there was a lot of German scientists after World War II. He went to the United States side, and then I want to talk about how compromised was Operation Paperclip. But first of all, let's talk about what was it, okay, who was involved, and of course, some of the top people who went where.
So Operation Paperclip was the U.S. government's program to bring Nazi science to America to work for the United States, and during the Cold War or the early stages of the Cold War. Excuse me. There were many of them who had been under Soviet control first. So, Germany was split in two, and East Germany went to the Soviet Union, West Germany to British and the Americans. And a lot of these Nazi scientists who were in East Germany and fell under Soviet occupation ended up being blackmailed by the Soviet intelligence and, kind of given option, hey, you can work for us or you can go off to Nuremberg, And
Which pretty much what happened to the Americans. I mean, you can work for us or you can go to Nuremberg. It's not even a big difference.
Yeah. But what they would often do is send them over to West Germany with an escape, right? But they'd be double agents of the KGB. So Traub, for example, escaped East Germany, came into the British zone, and he's like, oh, I can work for you now, But they had already flipped him to the Soviet Union. So he came over, and there were many others, because there were all sorts of other guys that came from Insel Reims, but a lot of them too remained there, and they worked for the Soviet Union. And I would say that a lot of the best went to the Soviet Union or worked for the Soviet Union, Traub being one of them. This Insel Reims facility was like the leading virology institute in the world. And so these guys were some of the best of the best. Even though they were veterinarians make the best bioweaponeers because they understand a diverse amount of immune systems from animals.
They work with animals. Let me ask you something else. How much of what Third Reich was working on was stolen by the Soviets at the end of World War II? And what were some of these key research experiments that they were working on?
What I can say is that the Soviet Union, they got a lot of this Insel Reims facility, they were doing all sorts of research. Eric Traub was working for them, I think so, from 1945 all the way to 1948. And they developed all sorts of weapons with things like mycoplasma. It looks like they also developed HIV. That's what my work shows from this horse disease called equine infectious anemia virus. And they were looking at it in horse factories, being like these horses in factories that were used to produce serums and vaccines. They saw how much havoc it could wreak in those factories that were then being used to turn out vaccines. And it seems to me that they knew, okay, we can cause mass sabotage or mass contamination of Western vaccines in this manner. And the polio vaccines seemed to be that point where HIV had come, only it wasn't from monkeys. When they were producing these monkey kidney cultures, they used horse serum. They mixed it with horse serum. And that's where I'm thinking this HIV came through. And I specifically addressed that in the last chapter of my book.
You also talk about some of the harrowing CIA top secret reports. Out of all the CIA reports, and you list a few of them in the book, especially in the index sections of each chapter, we actually reference everything you talk about. What are some of these top three, let's say top three reports that you came across, top secret CIA reports, as far as the experiments are concerned?
In the CIA files, I would say there was a lot of, so some of the ones on Insel Reims, the Bacterial Research Institute on the island of Reims, where it was showing how they had captured Reims and they were looking for war crimes. That was one of them. Another one, there was an interesting one that showed them kind of looking at the ability for microbes to withstand the sterilization process of vaccines. And then I would also say some of the files on ticks being used as weapons. So hybridizing these Exodes ticks. Exodes ticks are the ones that spread Lyme disease, by the way, and all those other nasty ones. And it was interesting because it linked MP Chumakov. MP Chumakov, it linked him to biological warfare, and there's a key document that shows them talking about ticks, and they reference his expedition to the Siberian regions. And that's where I can show that MP Chumakov was a bioweaponeer, which is a big deal because, as you know, in the last chapter, I talked about how he collaborated with Albert Sabin from the United States on the polio vaccines that would be given to many millions of Americans.
What do you think? I mean, Chumakov, that's the correct pronunciation of his last name. He's one of the top virologists now in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And so you have if I'm not mistaken, you told me that his son is working for the Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah, his son is running vaccine safety and review at the FDA.
So let's for people to understand this, the guy was one of the top virologists in Russia, working with Russian government, Stalin and company after World War II. We're talking that his son today is one of the top people working on the vaccine safety in the United States. So that we're clear about this.
And let me explain something else. So MP Chumakov was a bioweaponeer for the Soviet Union, and he was one of Stalin's top bioweaponeers, and he was involved in testing out bioweapons on the Muslims and Mongolians in the Siberian region starting in 1937, and they started spreading these tick plagues all over the place down there. And according to Loftus and his sources have told him that he was responsible for about 2 to 3 million deaths, him and his expedition. And then he also met with Eric Traub on Insel Reims twice in 1947. Because it was under Soviet authority. He went to meet with him about the virus lymphocytic chorea meningitis, which the SV40 virus that contaminated the polio vaccines and was given to about half the US population. This virus acts a lot like this LCM virus that he went to go consult with Eric Traub about. He also worked to some degree with Jonas Salk. So it wasn't just Albert Sabin. He also worked with Salk. The Salk vaccine and the Sabin vaccine were both contaminated by this SV40 virus. And this guy was a hardcore bioweaponeer. From
what you're saying, sorry to interrupt you, Adam, because we have about 10 minutes left, and I have so many things I want to talk to you about. What you're saying is that the United States government, they absolutely conducted biological experiments on Americans. And you mentioned a few of them, if I'm not mistaken: Operation Big Itch, Operation Big Buzz, Operation Drop, Operation Mayday. What are some of these operations? Like, what do they mean? Like, exactly, what is the purpose of each one of them? And what are the consequences of these experiments? Because we know of some of them conducted on Black Americans in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken. But like, what are the consequences of those experiments conducted back in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s of the United States, today on the United States population?
Yeah, so this was in a program called the U.S. Biological Simulant Program, simulant as in simulation. They would use these so-called harmless microbes, but they found out later that they weren't so harmless, and a lot of them, it seems that Eric Traub had weaponized. There was one called Serratia marcescens that was used heavily. Bacillus subtilis variant Niger was another one. There were many of these different microbes, and so what they would do is spray them all over the place. And this happened in San Francisco. This happened all over the United States, and it seems to be going on to this day. It's laws. There are laws like Title 50, 1520A that allow it, as long as they say it's to protect against biological warfare or it's any kind of research activity. And that is a very vague term among other things, pharmaceutical, agricultural, medical, therapeutic, or research activity was what the law said. And this had been done nationwide. And Eric Traub was actually the one supervising a lot of these. And so,
am I correct to say that the problem with all of these tests, or even biological or bacteriological war, is that it does not leave evidence of tampering? Like, we have no idea who's doing this. We have no idea, like, it's not a nuclear weapon. We can say, it's the Russians, the Americans, it's Israelis, it's Pakistan, or it's North Korea. We have no idea who's responsible. And especially today with transhumanism, artificial intelligence, you have so many ways of actually getting, these pathogens into a human body without us knowing anything about it. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's the reason why biological warfare was the go-to for waging wars, or for terrorism and such, is because you could always blame it on nature and say, hey, that was an act of nature, global warming.
Way to kill a lot of people. If you're a terrorist, it's a great, or if not, if you're the elite and you need to get rid of the population. I mean, look what they're talking about in Davos. They want to reduce the population by 7 billion people.
Then do incapacitating agents too, ones that aren't fatal, but ones that tire and exhaust. So that's a big theme in my book, is that a lot of these agents aren't fatal, but they tire and exhaust. And actually keeping people alive but worn out works even better, because then it becomes an economic weapon. You have a nation of people that are worn out, they can't work.
The cradle to grave mentality, absolutely. Would you say that, again, we could talk about the psychophysical weapons, which is what psychotronic weapons, for example, which is pharmacological means of chemical and also biological character, having a range of its own fluctuation, no equivalent, for example, to rhythm of a brain, the central nervous system, and therein influencing functioning of a brain's psychotropic weapons.
Yeah. And so neurotropic biological weapons would be like the bioweapon equivalent of that. Like all of these agents that Eric Traub worked on, they weren't really fatal, but they would cause a neurotropic disease.
Because you become easily controllable, isn't that the case?
Yeah, it's something that is very stealth. It's hard to diagnose. It doesn't cause a lot of inflammation, but it causes mental illnesses, neurological disorders, and a lot of the same can be said of the vaccines that use that antigen that he also, used to weaponize his pathogens. They also cause this very same chronic disease, this slow chronic disease. So you take out the immune system, and then you also have this secondary neurotropic effect. and
like, if you think about this, again, I loved your book, and I hope everybody goes out and actually buys it. Trine Day Press, my publisher in the United States, trinedaypress.org, I think the page is, but in any case, look for my book in the United States, and it's the same publisher. And the thing is that the Americans, they've started this research in the pre-war period, as you say in your book, and have continued after the war as part of different programs. For example, MK Ultra, mind control, remote alteration of human behavior, which is MK Delta. We can talk about Bluebird, we can talk about Artichoke. How do all of these programs fit into the biological weapons program?
Yeah, there were some of these that bled into it. I know there was one called MK Delta, I think.
That's what I just said, yeah.
Yeah, MK Delta was one that included biologic weapons, and I believe there was some elements of MK Ultra that looked at biologic weapons. But
because you know what, Adam, the most universal target for these psychophysical weapons is our brain.
Yeah,
the brain of a person, which adjusts functioning all systems of an organism and carries out through the processes and defines the behavior of the person. And the human brain works in a range of four kinds of brain waves. And so if you can attack that, okay, you can destroy a person's well-being. And needless to say, you become what we talked about before, from cradle to grave mentality.
Yeah, that's essentially the idea here, is that they fit perfectly into that whole attack the brain and central nervous system and and control the thinking and things like that. Now, I've seen some of, like, for example, your interview with that woman talks about some of that. I haven't gone too far into the nanotechnology and the biotechnology, although I can link Morgellons disease to biotechnology, but that, would be like more present day stuff. We're developing these kinds of agents and technologies that attack the brain and central nervous system, because mass death wasn't the goal here. It was attack the brain and central nervous system, and these earlier weapons were some of the forerunners of that. Eric Traub developed psychotropic agents or neurotropic agents, and that was a major line of study for him.
Would you say that, again, if you're looking at, for example, the space race, okay, the Russians got there first, the atomic bomb race, Americans were first. What about the race for this most deadly pathogens? Because again, I mean, we all understand that Third World War is coming, whether it's going to be a thermonuclear war or, bioterrorism, whatever it is, we are coming there. And so you have the Russians, you have the Americans, you have the Chinese, needless to say, you have the British. Okay, so who is number one right now in the world? I mean, it's not something you really want to be number one in, but again, the Russians, went into space first. The Americans got their atomic bomb first. So, as far as the bioweapons technology, okay, who would you say has the upper hand right now?
I would say Russia is still in the lead because they inherited not only Eric Traub's best work back in 1945, they also acquired the best of the best in Unit 731, which was the Japanese program, and they have been in the lead since. And it looks like the whole COVID-19 situation appears to have been from this Siberian lab, Vector, because there was an explosion at Vector in, I think it was September or October in 2019, and there were papers being published by Western intelligence or Western biodefense saying, explosion at Vector, hoping for the best, but expecting the worst. And they were expecting a pandemic, and they were talking about how SARS was spreading at that time. And then what happened was someone in China gets sick, Wuhan lab goes and isolates it, brings it back to the lab, and then they all get sick. That's what it appears to me. So Russia was also, I can also link them to these Ebola-like diseases, Marburg and Ebola. This MP Chumakov guy, actually, the MP Chumakov guy who I talked about. And these viruses were most closely related to the Crimean hemorrhagic fevers.
What's that?
Crimean hemorrhagic fever is like a relative of Ebola and Marburg. These are the viruses that cause that mass bleeding in Africa, and you basically hemorrhage to death. It liquefies your organs, and you just basically bleed out. So I can link that. I can link those viruses. Also, Lassa fever. That's another one that was very closely related to these Siberian hemorrhagic fevers, because these hemorrhagic fevers actually show up in Siberia first, not Africa.
Let me ask you something else, because we only have a couple of minutes left. You mentioned the Rockefellers earlier. I mean, we can't talk about any of this stuff without mentioning the Rockefellers. When did the Rockefeller family get involved in bioweapons research, and for what purpose?
Well, the Rockefeller Institute, of course, they had Eric Traub studying there and researching there before he left to go back to Germany. And they actually set up programs all over the world to study outbreaks. And one thing I can say is that they were studying spirochetes in different racial populations. So ethnic bioweapons comes into play here as well. I mean, so different races will respond differently to different pathogens, and they were really interested in how the Latin Americans, how they had a syphilis program in the prisons. They also studied syphilis in blacks and African Americans early on, like in the Tuskegee. They also studied, because we dropped biological weapons on North Korea, they're also studying, they had programs over there and they could assimilate some of that data on how it was affecting Asian populations. So this whole ethnicity thing comes into play here when we're talking about the Rockefeller Institute and, you know, things like eugenics.
You can literally eliminate people on ethnic basis, whether it's the Jews, whether it's the blacks, whether it's the look at the United States. They're having all these secret biolabs all over, very close to the Russian borders, and the Russians have been complaining about that. And I'm going to have to get you back because we're out of time. Before we go, again, Adam Finnegan, the author of The Sleeper Agent, The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator, Antigens of Biological Warfare. My publisher, his publisher, Trine Press in the United States. Before we go, Adam, how can people follow your work? Because I'd very much like for everybody to tune in to what you're doing.
Yeah, I do have a website for my book called it's located at thesleeperagent.com. You can find me there. Also, my book is on Amazon. I have a Rumble channel, an Odyssey channel, and a YouTube channel.
What's your YouTube channel? Actually, I saw it the other day and it's really, really interesting.
The handle is just AW Finnegan.
AW Finnegan.
Yeah.
Adam, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah. Awesome.
Take care, man.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.